So, hi everybody. Welcome to this next edition of the workshop on international survey methods. We're excited to have Caroline Deschak from ICF International. She's the food security survey manager and qualitative research lead there. Going to be presenting some co-authored work dealing with sort of mixed methods, I would say, mix of qualitative and survey research. So as always, we're going to do about 30 minutes of presentation, 30 minutes of Q&A. If you want to put questions in the chat, we'll answer them in the order received during the Q&A period, or you can wait and answer or ask your question live during that period as well. So I'll turn it over to Carrie. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Luke. Appreciate the invitation to share this co-authored and diverse group of authorship that I'm just representing from USAID, from ICF, and from Center for Basic Research in Uganda, and from Research Plus Africa based in Kenya. And thanks everybody for joining and for your interest. I'm going to share my screen and give me a shout when you can see it.
Looks good.
Okay. So today I'm happy to share a little bit with you all about assessing a qualitative research approach to improving locally relevant food security and resilience measures. Talking about lessons learned so far in two different countries, zones within them, Uganda and Kenya. Assessing is a strong word for what we'll be able to really dig into within the next half an hour, but I am really hopeful that within this time, we can really aim to show how our activities in Uganda and Kenya worked towards our research objectives and activity objectives, and how lessons learned from those countries so far are shaping this ongoing activity in the upcoming countries. So all work that we're going to talk about happened under the umbrella of the Surveys for Monitoring and Resilience and Food Security, or SMRFS project. This is an ICF International implemented and USAID Bureau for Resilience, Environment, and Food Security funded project that supports collecting and using high-quality population-based survey data. The principal objective of the SMRFS project is to carry out survey activities, including the design, implementation, and technical support of those population-based surveys we mentioned. But critically, another objective is to do support activities which enhance our ability to collect quality and data and use it from those surveys, both for internal USAID and for external users. Among those support activities is the livelihood coping strategies and severity ranking research activity that we're going to talk about today, otherwise known as the LCS research activity. These two concepts are something that I'm going to say a lot of times within the next half hour. Livelihood coping strategies, or LCS, is the core of the work that we're talking about. And livelihood coping strategies are actions taken to try and mitigate an acute food shortage. And critically, they're actions that also impact livelihoods of the people who perform them. For example, if we're short on food, we might have to sell something that we might not sell otherwise. That may be a livelihood coping strategy. Livelihood coping strategies are because we are working, because we need money, because we need food, right? But that's a typical activity. And LCS are atypical, something we do not seek to do and maybe can't do every day, but which are responding to an acute food shortage that is atypical. Another really important term is Integrated Phase Classification Scale, or IPC scale, and any food security or livelihoods folks here might be very familiar with it. It's a common and the gold standard at the moment on the global scale for classifying severity and magnitude of food insecurity. So this scale uses a convergence of evidence approach where it takes a bunch of different kinds of indicators from economic to food security outcomes, etc., consolidates them, and within a panel classifies how severe is the food insecurity in an area right now, from phase 1, no food insecurity, to phase 5, catastrophic food insecurity, which on a larger scale is famine. This is the scale we use within our work. So the LCS research activity aims to do two things, the first of which we're going to focus more on. What the point of the activity is to use qualitative research to inform and build into a survey module. The research activity produces IPC, that scale compatible, and contextually relevant lists of livelihood coping strategies. And those lists are what are then used to inform a survey module. We do that, and we have a focus on making these lists contextually relevant within our objectives, because we know that everyone uses livelihood coping strategies when faced with a food shortage. But the resource profile you have available where you live, culturally, geographically, etc., makes a difference in which ones you use and when. So we can't just apply a general list to the whole world. We have to figure out what works and what makes sense for people in their different contexts. So that contextually relevant part of our objective is really important. So we're making these lists through qualitative research, and big picture, we're generating overall guidance in how to successfully create these lists that will be a global public good. So the research activity produces, ranked by IPC phase 2 to 5, LCS lists within zones that we're going to see on a map in a minute within each country we're talking about. Here, that's Uganda and Kenya. It also produces a more traditional qualitative research output, which is a textual analysis of the qualitative data for each country. That helps us contextualize and understand the meaning behind when people use different livelihood coping strategies in their community. Then further on, we're going to create a global guidance document. The LCS research activity is qualitative work that feeds then into further activities. But today in this presentation, what we're talking about is just the LCS research activity, the qualitative stuff, and a little bit of what it feeds into next, which is the LCS index. That's a survey module, and it's informed by the qualitative work that we're doing. Down the line, all of this feeds into a further chain of indicators that can be calculated when that LCS index result feeds into the FuseNet matrix analysis and then into a humanitarian food assistance averted indicator being generated by USAID. That's just a little context of where this information is going to go. So far, as mentioned, we've done this work in Uganda and Kenya within the past couple of years. Upcoming is likely Mali as well as other countries. Within each country, we're not in the whole country, but rather a USAID selected RFZ or resilience focus zone, which we'll see on maps in a second. Within those RFZs, they're further broken down by a couple different livelihood zones. It's pure qualitative methods using focus group discussions and in-depth interviews. It uses purposeful selection of study sites and participants by convenience. And what we're aiming for is equal representation among the different livelihood zones we'll see in a second, and by gender and age group. Okay. FGDs and IDIs were all audio recorded for later transcription for that textual analysis. This photo, as well as others throughout the presentation, were all with written consent. So here's a look at where we actually worked within Uganda and Kenya. As you can see, not the entire country, but rather the colored areas. In both countries, the colored area represents the RFZO Resilience Focus Zone, which is USAID selected. Within that, the RFZ is broken down into livelihood zones. We care about those livelihood zones because we know that general livelihoods in a zone make a difference in what livelihood coping strategies people use and when. So in Uganda, there were two broad livelihood zones identified within the RFC. As you can see, agricultural in green and agropastoral in blue. In Kenya, those were three, given a significant pastoral zone identified within Kenya. So in Kenya, there are agricultural, agropastoral, and pastoral zones. We create a ranked livelihood coping strategy list for each one of those livelihood zones within the RFC. This work was successful and possible because of fantastic implementing partners in both of these countries. In Uganda, that was the Center for Basic Research, or CBR, based in Kampala. And in Kenya, that was Research Plus Africa. These were the organizations that helped us both review our work and implement the work on the ground, as well as do initial analysis. So how did this work actually look? How did we collect this data? We used 3 different data collection events in order to collect the data that we were looking for. Principally, this included focus group discussions. Through really rigorous community entry procedures in the study sites selected, we came in and identified people to participate in focus group discussions who had lived most of their lives in the zone and were household decision makers. We wanted these people to engage in the livelihood of interest. For example, in the agricultural zone, we wanted it to be somebody who had planted something within the past year, right? And who had also experienced some level of food insecurity in recent years. After carrying out those focus group discussions, which were recruited beforehand, we snowball sampled to identify people to participate in further supplemental in-depth interviews of 2 kinds. First, realizing predictable data gaps in the focus group discussions, given sensitivity of the questions and given the subject area, as well as the sampling approach. We wanted to carry out in-depth interviews with people who were more likely to be in more severe IPC phases 4 and 5. Those people are really hard to get in a focus group discussion, and naturally it can be very difficult to have a conversation with them in a current situation of severe food insecurity. So IDIs were a very useful tool to more closely access a population that had closer lived experiences with that. Lastly, the third data collection event was a different kind of IDI with a key informant who had an informed community level perspective on local livelihood coping strategies and drivers. Critically, within the focus group discussions and in-depth interviews with general population, we used a couple methods in the tool to help people get over sensitive topics and be able to feel protected. And so we asked for information, not personally necessarily, but people could report information in the third person and in conditional, i.e., I didn't do something like this, but I know somebody who did. Or I've never done this, but if things were really bad, I would do this. Each country, Uganda and Kenya, ended up having 45 to 60 total data collection events. Each of those data collection events had a similar set of content, what we did within the data collection. It started with a warm-up and went into, first, identifying LCS used in the community. In this area, what do people do when they're faced with food shortages? Do you do this? Do you do that? And what are the perceived outcomes of doing this? Are there negative consequences to doing it or even positive? After identifying those LCS in the community, we do a severity ranking by those IPC phases you remember. For each of those strategies you mentioned, what situation do you have to be in order to do it? A 2, not great, but less bad, or a 4, or emergency, quite bad food security situation? That looked like a card sorting activity on the ground. So the LCS identification, we used cards, neutral colored ones, and in a standardized language across moderators and teams. This was English in both Uganda and Kenya as the colonial language there. We, as participants identified LCS, an LCS was written down on a neutral colored card, like the ones you see in the photos. Then, when we got to severity ranking, we pulled out colored cards that corresponded with IPC phases 2, 3, 4, and 5, different phases of acute food insecurity. And we helped orient participants in what we meant by each of those phases, and they helped us take those livelihood coping strategies on neutral colored cards and rank them under the colored card associated with the IPC phase. Participants were encouraged to move those cards themselves, and very often they did and really engaged in the process. That process in the focus group discussion was designed to reach a consensus on a severity ranking, and in IDIs was just a final decision by the interviewee about the ranking of each strategy. The colors we used were previously validated globally from the IPC global group, but not locally specific to where we were. But the graduated color scheme from yellow, orange, pink to red seemed intuitive to most participants. This is a material we used and some phrases that we used very in-depth in training with the moderators to simplify and help explain to the participants what we mean by each of the IPC phases. This is an effort to make sure that our ranking is objective based on the existing IPC scale and not relative. That is, since our goal is to make these LCS lists IPC compatible, we need to be sure that people are understanding what we mean by IPC phase 2, not just a relative ranking such as I would do this first, I would do this next, I would do this last. So a couple pictures just so you get a sense of what it looked like in the field. These are some participants across Uganda and Kenya doing the severity ranking. The idea is that all of this data is participant driven, but that the moderators, of course, are there to support, to orient, to solicit reasons for why each thing is happening. And as you can see, participants tended to really enjoy this part and engaged. Interestingly, even when the language in which the cards were written on was not their own, or they could not necessarily read them. So we get to analysis. Each one of those data collection events resulted in a ranked list of livelihood coping strategies that the participants had come up with. So this graph outlines the general analysis structure by livelihood zone. The first thing that might be notable, especially to this crowd, would be that the structure looks a little bit like the literature review funnel process. And it is a little bit like that, but it's, of course, qualitative work, and it's not the same as that, but there are definite similarities. We start out in each livelihood zone, take the livelihood zone 1 in orange rust colored there. And we have all of the unique observations of strategies that came from every data collection event. We group like strategies first. For example, one focus group discussion said that they oversell goats. Another group also said that they oversell goats. We group those together into a master list and say, oversell goats is on the list. It was mentioned by this many different data collection events, and it had an overall mode as measure of central tendency severity ranking of IPC phase 3. From that point, we do some cleaning to take out any ineligible or unintelligible strategies from the master list. Then we're down at a clean list. From there, we start grouping like strategies with the goal to whittle the list down into between 11 and 16 strategies only. So we group like strategies into bigger and bigger buckets according to what makes sense and start whittling the list down to all valid strategies. The last step, getting from stage 2 to the final list, is having to pick and choose from the valid strategies. Which ones are the ones that serve us the best for our goal of informing an LCS index survey module? We do that by squaring a couple aspects of each of the strategies. We look at the frequency of mention. If it was a strategy mentioned by only, for example, 2 data collection events out of 25, then it might not be a very relevant strategy. So we might decide to remove that one. The strategy might not be specific enough. That's another criteria of exclusion. That means if the strategy overlaps with other strategies and is not mutually exclusive, or if we can't pin it down to something that's done strictly because of food security, that's a strategy that may not be specific enough, and we may remove it. The third exclusion criteria at this stage is sensitivity, and that means sensitivity to an IPC phase. If we have one strategy that we've seen a lot, but some people have ranked it a 2, some people have ranked it a 5, some people have ranked it a 3, and it's all spread out, that's a strategy with low sensitivity to an IPC phase, and that doesn't serve us as well towards our final purpose. So that's an exclusion factor. After whittling down using those exclusion factors, we find ourselves with our final products. A final list for each livelihood zone, for example, agricultural, one for agropastoral, etc. And those are later synthesized into one big fat final list at the RFC level. Here's an example of the final list in the pastoral livelihood zone of the Kenya RFZ. So an example product. You'll note it has 11 items on it here. And this has some elements on it you can probably recognize quickly as the reason that we need contextually relevant data, and participants are who help us get there. For example, there are examples given, such as in the third line, like building or digging to get food. Those are examples given by the participants, and they will help make it relevant to further participants in the pastoral zone. Local names are given where they're relevant, as you see on line 10. Changa, bang, mira, to buy food are all locally relevant terms within the livelihood zone that we were working in. Further terminology is also contextualized, such as on line 5, the example given like lactating or blessed animals, which is what people referred to them as there. And all of those are elements that speak to why it's so important to contextualize these livelihood coping strategies and what participants in this qualitative data were able to offer us in the richness of their comments that let us really have a list of strategies that responded to what they saw, what they do, and what they would do in different IPC phases. The next step you might recall is, okay, we finished our qualitative activities and got to the lists. What are those lists for? And you'll recall that those lists are meant to inform the creation of the LCS index, which is a survey module. In this case, we were using them to apply in our population-based surveys in both Uganda and Kenya, also carried out by my colleagues on the Smurfs team. So once we had our qualitative products, our lists that look like this, we took them and fitted the contents of those lists into survey modules called the LCS index, like this one where you see 2 items on. In the Kenya Midline Survey, participants in the survey were asked a series of questions that corresponded with the livelihood coping strategies we identified with the qualitative work. So participants were asked, for example, within the past 30 days, due to food shortages in your household, did you or any household member sell small animals like chickens or goats at a normal price to buy food? And the respondent can say yes, no. A no response will lead to a sub-question that asks why, with a couple other response options that the interviewer helps us map out. That means, since those surveys were already carried out, that we have some data already coming back from these contextualized LCS index modules from Uganda and Kenya. And we were really pleased to have that data come back. What were the results of that survey data using this module to give us a further idea on how well our qualitative work is responding to the need to contextualize our survey modules. So far, we're seeing results from Uganda and Kenya surveys, and it's good news. There's a pattern of affirmative responses across the 11 to 16 items, which is encouraging. We're seeing a rough negative trend of affirmative responses across severity, and that's what we expect. So if there's a less severe strategy ranked as IPC phase 2, more people might be doing that strategy. But if there's a really severe ranked strategy, like an IPC phase 4 strategy, we hope to not see a lot of people doing that strategy. We want to see that rough negative trend, and we're seeing it across both Uganda and Kenya. That's encouraging for people's responsiveness to the questions, and that the questions are getting at what we want them to. The overall refusal rate was something we also paid attention to in the non-responses, certainly in the sensitive questions as well. You might have noted there are questions related to engaging in sexual activities and even illegal activities, for example. And we recognize the extreme sensitivity that those questions can imply. The overall refusal rate by item in Uganda and Kenya never was above 0.2%, which is good news. We also, since these surveys were implemented on CAPI, and some of them involve some fancy footwork in the LCS index to get the skip patterns, et cetera, right, we didn't have any identified CAPI issues, which was also great news. That includes in Kenya, which for reasons not important to go into, but that in Kenya had a little bit greater complexity in the filtering processes needed. Over the course of Uganda and Kenya, we learned a lot, and we're taking that now into our processes for upcoming countries. Overall, in training and pre-test, we recognize that this deductive approach, that we go and say, what do you all do? We don't go with pre-formulated answers and ask yes or no. Did you do this? Check yes, check no, right? We recognize this deductive approach requires a lot from the moderators, and that we allocate a greater time than one usually may for activities of this scope, about 8 days usually, to training and a pretest. Practice, practice, practice is so important to get the moderators all on the same page, to get everyone to internalize these concepts that I'm sure you all are seeing. Even some experts that might be in the room can be complex to try to understand. The card sorting activity is a unique piece of what we did, and we recognize that there are limitations to that activity because of literacy and language. But we're finding continually that the activity really foments engagement, ownership in the activity, and transparency. Nobody's sitting there with a clipboard facing away from everyone and writing notes, right? People really become part of the activity, even in less engaged groups. It also facilitates the analysis because we start the analysis right in the field by having to funnel responses and write them down succinctly on a card. We already have a good kickstart to a standardized analysis. Severity ranking is probably the biggest challenge of this activity to get to our objective of not just a relative ranking, but compatibility with the existing IPC scale. That means that training really requires a heavy focus on those different IPC phases. And participants during data collection do need support orientation by the moderators to avoid doing a relative ranking. Finally, the mixed qualitative methods have a little bit of complexity to them, given that we've combined FGDs and IDIs of two types. But we're finding so far that it does help achieve participant selection objectives, and it amplifies a small convenience sample. It also better accommodates sensitive topics like some of the ones we mentioned, because some of them are not very amenable topics to talk about in a focus group discussion to avoid social desirability bias. And some of them are better talked about by a key informant on a community level rather than having it feel personal to someone. Lastly, and I can't stress this enough, such an important team role we find is rock gathering. Really, wind, animals, and children in a card sorting activity were a challenge that we continually had across all sorts of contexts. We usually ended up having a designated rock gatherer each time. Very helpful. So this whole presentation centers around some details about qualitative work, yes, but we're building a bridge from qualitative work to a survey module. And strong qualitative information is really key to being able to generate these locally relevant survey inputs. This activity has been made successful so far by using a deductive approach and by using mixed qualitative methods, because those are the things that help us understand the different meanings attached to similar LCS across different livelihood zones. So we're really working hard to continue with the things that have been successful so far, as well as recognize where we can continue improving methods to be able to reach this goal and build that bridge into customizing a survey module using this. And we're still in ongoing conversations about that and interested in perspectives from folks like you on it. Some limitations of our work are that first, the IPC guidelines do necessitate triangulation of results like these with other indicators to be able to classify an IPC phase. And we do recognize that we don't have the scope to triangulate those results with other quantitative indicators, much less anthropometric, climactic, et cetera, which are included in the IPC approach. We also understand that conditional information can enable prediction bias, which we're likely getting, as well as mentioned, social desirability bias when addressing sensitive topics. There are barriers to entering areas and being able to speak to the people we want to in areas with active conflict, and that's something that's far from unique to our activities. Finally, we don't have a systematic exploration of all of the key concepts that help contextualize coping. We explore them, but not necessarily systematically due to time limits. And that's, for example, consequences of carrying out X strategy. We ask about it, but we don't have time to go into it for a half an hour for each strategy, right? That's also a different kind of coping strategies called consumption coping strategies, which are often brought up. We don't systematically explore those aspects and others in this, and that information could, in another activity, be helpful. So as we close out, just looking forward, we're talking about methodological shifts that can help improve on some of the weaknesses or limitations identified. And principally, those center around that bigger challenge we mentioned, which is the severity ranking. How can we really make sure the severity ranking is aligned with the IPC scale, which we didn't make up, we are trying to work with? So a couple of the things we've proposed and are on the table discussion with our USAID folks right now are streamlining tools that'll help eliminate some confusion. It'll help us be able to more efficiently and streamline our data collection process. We're considering adding an expert validation of severity rankings, and by experts, we mean a mix of people who are experts in the IPC scale on a global level, as well as experts at a country level in each country on the food security and livelihoods context. In addition to that would be strengthening tool components around perceived consequences. That would really strengthen our ability to be able to understand, okay, are participants ranking this one in this way because they actually see a consequence behind it, or are they not understanding very well what we mean when we try to explain the IPC phases? So that would help us address the limitation of no systematic exploration of perceived consequences. And finally, we're considering ways to adapt the criteria for synthesizing those final lists that would help them be more tailored from the first moment of analysis to being put into a survey module. So with many thanks, as always, to all the U.S. government partners that are helping support this work, which is ongoing. Thank you a lot for your first attention these first few minutes. It's been a lot of information, but I'm really looking forward to hearing where some of you have some thoughts, would like any clarifications, or have some ideas for us. So thank you. Back to you, Luke.
Great, thanks so much for that really interesting presentation. Yeah, I know for our purposes at LAPOP, food security is one of our focuses on our survey. And then also, I think it's useful just thinking about questionnaire design in general. A lot of times we do pre-testing, but it's like taking our own questions and then seeing if they work in the field. But this is a totally different kind of bottom-up approach that I think is something for us to think about. So we'll take questions from the chat, or you can raise your hand on Zoom and ask your question live. I wanted to start it off by asking a clarifying question. So the card sorting activity seemed interesting, but I don't know if I fully understood it. So they're sorting based off, or they're ranking it based off how like how much they've done those activities, or how severe they think they are, or how effective they are at managing food security, or could you talk more about what the ranking is?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think about it as that, as mentioned, the content of each data collection event is sort of twofold. First, we want to identify the what. When faced with any shortage of food, what does one do to try to fix it? That what is the livelihood coping strategy. Then second, when we go into the severity ranking, I think about it as the when, actually. And that's because for me, the severity ranking corresponds with how bad does the food security situation have to be in order for you to do this strategy. And that how bad is split into IPC phase 2, 3, 4, and 5 for our considerations. So if we go to the color tool, which supports us, for example, we can see that IPC phase 2 is the yellow one. So we help explain that to participants by saying, well, that's when you usually manage to eat enough. You get enough quantity, mostly, but not always. And you struggle to eat well. You're lacking quality. That situation, the when of that situation is IPC phase 2. So we want to know which LCS do people here use when you are in IPC phase 2. Same for IPC phase 3, described here, phase 4, described here in pink, and 5 in red. So I think about it as first we identify the what, livelihood coping strategy, and then the when, under what IPC phase.
Thanks, that helps. I have a question from Hannah Ridge, which I'll read for the recording. So it looks in the pictures there like there were more items under some categories than others, maybe even a lot in one category. Was your experience that they saw the options as a complete list? Could they add to the option items in the discussion phase?
Thanks, Hannah. Yeah, what we had a really interactive process, and something that we work a lot with the moderators with during training is how do we approach the ranking to try to help people do an objective ranking against the IPC scale and not a relative ranking, when we know that people have an ordered process of household decision making. So how did we approach that? We started by first ranking, putting down the yellow IPC phase 2 card and saying, which ones of these cards or strategies do you do during IPC phase 2? Oh, we oversell goats. Okay, perfect. We take on extra work like digging that we hate. Okay, perfect. And sometimes you end up with a lot there. But then we go to IPC phase 3 and go, well, what about when things get worse? Then what would you do? Okay, well, this one, this one, this one. No, now things got even worse. IPC phase 4, what would you do there? And so on. So people might start out by stacking them in more in one category, as you mentioned, but we have a dynamic process where people can move them, talk about them, say, oh, wait, now that I see the full range of IPC phases, I see that actually I wouldn't do this unless things were worse. Move it over here. And so up until the last moment, cards can be moved. And in fact, we encourage it as it also foments conversation. Anytime someone wants to move a card, we say, why? Tell us why. Right? And it foments a conversation around it that's captured in the textual analysis. By the way, we do expect to see very few livelihood coping strategies in phase 5, as phase 5 corresponds with a near exhaustion of coping by the IPC definition.
Great. So I was wondering about the application of the findings. So in terms of, I guess, generalizability, so you want the measures to be localized and be relevant to specific populations, but you also want them to be generalizable, right? So it's like you have this bias variance trade-off where it's like you're using a lot of information about that specific context from this one region in this category, this pastoral community, but then you want measures that you could apply to other areas. So I was wondering how you thought about that. Like, are you trying to make it specific to an area and a community, or do you want something that's like, we can have a list of standard food security measures that we can apply in any country?
It's probably the root of this work, exactly what you're describing, Luke, and what are the trade-offs, right, of contextualization? What do we want something that can be applied across the board and therefore increase comparability, or do we want something that really we can be sure is tailored to a specific population? And sorry, I'm making you dizzy flipping back and forth. We go back to the maps. In our activity, we're charged with creating these ranked livelihood coping strategies lists at 2 different levels. And those levels are within the zones that we see here, which are specifically USAID identified zones. The same zones you see here are the ones that we go in to do the qualitative research. We create the lists, and then we plug them into surveys that are then turned back around on populations of these exact same zones. So in that context, it works really well. We create lists at one level, which is the livelihood zone level. So everywhere in Kenya that's orange, the pastoral zone, we have a list of that's going to be applied to them. Everywhere that's green in Kenya, we have a list that's going to be applied with them. And applied with them because they themselves created it. But we also have a second layer, which is the RFZ level list. That is, we also have a list that can apply to everything that's in color in Kenya. And we create that list by synthesizing things in a different way from all of the livelihood zones and trying to synthesize them and going, where are the commonalities enough between the livelihood zones where we can apply it all over these parts of Kenya, for example. That's something we've had a lot of discussion about, exactly as you said, the trade-offs that are in there, because as soon as we make a synthesized RFZ level list, a list for everything in color, we are trading off the level of contextualization that we can have. And we're getting more general again. And we know that when we contextualize these lists, 2 things change, not just one. Which livelihood coping strategies you use could change, and when you might use them, under which IPC phase, can also change. So it's a discussion we have been continuing. To what extent should we categorize more broadly, or to what extent, to keep with our contextually relevant objectives, should we keep within just a livelihood zone list and say this applies here? Right. So far, we are mostly focused on the latter. We're focused on the contextualization at the livelihood zone level, and looking forward to make this more applicable and more relevant to external partners outside USAID. We'd like to think about the best way to synthesize more broadly relevant lists too. The World Food Program, critically, is who has made a lot of the foundations on this, as some of us might be aware of on the call. They have a different approach, but that lends itself better to broader generalization across zones and less so to very contextualized areas as we do.
Great, thanks. And hearing no other questions, I'll continue to fill the time. So I was wondering, this isn't a very fleshed out question, but just a general thought, like thinking broadly about the way you measure food security. There's this interesting way you do it of, have you done these different things to cope with food insecurity? But then you could also think about like the actual situation of the person. So it's like outcomes versus resilience in a way. So a person might be starving. If you think about two people, one person, both people are starving, one person's better at resilience and is doing more of these extreme things to deal with that, and another person isn't doing those things. Maybe they don't feel comfortable selling, their um I forget what you called it, spirit animal or something like that. So do you have are you thinking about putting other measures that are just straight up asking them, like, have you gone hungry versus these kind of resilience? Have you done these things to deal with those?
I'm glad you brought back up the topic of resilience too, as we've been talking in food security terms mostly, but of course it relates so closely to resilience. And in fact, um, the work we're doing was originally couched a little bit in we are creating a resilience measurement input in the survey. But after starting to speak about it more and more, we realized that what we're really trying to get at is something a little different. What we're actually using this data, plugging it into the LCS index in the survey for, is currently is a measure of acute food insecurity using livelihood coping strategies. So if we ask in this survey module, um, if a respondent or their household sold small animals like chickens or goats at a normal price to buy food within the last 30 days, and that person says yes, then we can assume that that is one of several questions here that will contribute to a proxy indicator for not resilience into the future, but for current acute food insecurity of that household. So these are proxy indicators for that. And it's really of interest to figure out how they can more cleanly fit into an analysis framework for resilience. Tango certainly has a very developed set of resilience indicators that to some extent include coping, but much more broadly. And those are still a little bit under construction, being reworked. We apply some of them within our surveys. But coping still doesn't cleanly fit into the analysis structure. And it's because we're not sure still how we can make something that is coping someone has done now reflect their future. Because some people argue that applying a coping strategy is good because you have a resource to tap. And some people say it's bad because, well, you shouldn't have to tap that resource. Some people say that it's purely negative. Negative is a very debated term that you'll notice we didn't specifically use today to describe livelihood coping strategies, because every livelihood coping strategy will have some negative outcome in the medium to long term, but some argue that they also have a positive outcome in the short term. They might have just alleviated your food shortage today. So those kind of topics are hotly debated in the scheme of to what extent we can use these to measure resilience, and inputs to that and suggestions are welcome.
Great, thanks. Any other questions or suggestions or thoughts about this? Well, like I said, I thought it was really interesting and useful for us thinking about questionnaire design and pre-testing and how we validate the questions that we're asking, and making them relevant to the context we're studying. So appreciate it. And everybody, please join me in thanking our presenter, Caroline Deschak, for this excellent presentation. We'll return next month with the final WISM presentation of the semester. So hope to see you there. And thanks again, Carrie.
Thanks a lot to you, Luke, for the invitation, and thanks everyone for joining today. It was great to share and happy to follow up with my contact on the screen. Cheers, everyone.
Appreciate it. Bye, everybody.